Sensory input can be a mystery and even a term you may never think about until you have a child who struggles with sensory processing. Come find out what all is involved in processing sensory input and what does occupational therapy have to do with it. Hi, welcome back to Project Parenthood. I am your host, Chelsea Dorsage, licensed marriage family therapist. I am here to join you on your conscious parenting journey, bringing more curiosity, openness, acceptance, kindness, and non judgment along the way. My goal is for us to accept what is out of our control, commit to improving our parenting life, and discover better outcomes for ourselves and our family. I am so excited today to have a special guest on our episode, Mindy Wagner. She is a pediatric OT and Baby Steps Pediatric Therapy founder. She shares expert insights from over 18 years of supporting children with special needs. She's an alumni of Cal Poly Sloan with psychology emphasis and USC OT. Mindy combines professional expertise with personal experience as a mother of three. I'm so excited to have her on today. So, Mindy, thank you so much for being here today. And I think I just want to kind of dive in your years of experience, what parents tend to maybe not know enough of, or just haven't been introduced to about when it comes to either occupational therapy or sensory regulation. Kind of just what are those pieces that a lot of us parents are kind of almost missing or not aware of?
Yeah. So, I mean, if your child is able to process sensory information, typically, then you never even need to know about us or what we do. But if your child does have problems processing sensory information, when I say it like that, is you're like, oh, okay. But then when I say like your child's like perceiving the world in a very different way than you are, then people are like, oh, okay, let me pay attention. So I think it's really important that if you think your child has some sensory needs to look into that and see kind of exactly what they are. Because if you can figure those out, then a lot of times you can avoid meltdowns or situations where things get kind of out of control by, knowing what is going to trigger them or knowing if they're already a little dysregulated and then you're going to throw them into like another challenging situation. To just kind of like be aware of those things can really help dramatically.
Yeah, definitely. I have to imagine, because I think when we think of, like, I heard the word meltdown, right? We think of those things, and I know I've done an episode on just self-regulation and kind of touched briefly on the sensory, but sometimes we wouldn't even know that this is what's going on for them, right? That like this, that they're actually processing things differently, and we are
A
just
hundred,
assuming they're like it's like a behavioral thing, right? Like they just don't want
a
to.
100%. Yeah, so much these poor babies. And the way that you can tell is if it's behavioral or if it's a sensory thing is if, say, you're at home and your kid's having a meltdown and you act like you're going to leave the room and they stop crying, that's behavior. If they still can't calm themselves down, even though they know you're not watching them anymore, then that is probably a sensory issue.
Okay, yeah, that's good to know. That makes sense. I think, and we say sensory. I mean, this is anything like kind of maybe touch on that. How are they processing differently, or where would we see this, like in terms of their five senses, in terms of their right? Is this touch? Is this sounds? Is this like lights? Like, is
Yeah,
that all it is?
there's so many things so we assess eight different
Okay.
categories. So the first five, right, we all know: see, hearing, touch, taste, smell, all that. So for those types of things, let's just start with like the
Okay.
visual system. Okay, so um, kids typically, if they have problems processing sensory
Mhm.
information, are either going to be over responsive or under responsive. So if your child is having a hard time processing visual information, you might see things like if they're hypersensitive to visual
Mhm.
input, they might get very overwhelmed and like a room that has a lot of different things to look at, or have a hard time finding an object that's, on the floor with like a lot of other toys. And then you have the other children who are, not as responsive to visual inputs. So they're actually under responsive. And those are the kids who are going to be, you're like, it's right there. It's right in front of you. Look down, like, that aren't really seeing things. And then there's auditory processing. So if you're over responsive to auditory input, that's going to be kids that, any noise they hear, even
Right.
if it's not even that big of a noise, or they're distracted by any noise, even if it's just the dryer going off in the other room, or and then you have the opposite, the kids who are under responsive that don't really tend to hear anything
Yeah.
sometimes, or there'll be an ambulance that comes by and they're
Okay.
unfazed. So kind of stuff like that can kind of clue you in. um, and then for touch, like tactile processing, we see this a lot in kids who are over responsive. Those are the kids that don't like light touch. So those are the kids that you have to cut all their tags out of their
Right.
clothes. You have to make sure that their seams are lined up in their shoes when they put their socks on, because that's really going to
Right.
bother them. And then you have kids, or like if it's a younger kid, these are the babies that are just always taking off their clothes
Right.
and want to be naked, and and then the kids who are under responsive to touch, are just kind of like brush by something and not even feel it, or touch something and not even really be aware, or they might even like seek out feeling and touching
Okay.
everything
Okay.
because they're not getting enough of that input. um and then we have
Yeah.
taste, which can be a huge a huge thing for people who have a hard time processing sensory information. You have the kids who are
Hmm.
hypersensitive so to taste, so those are gonna be the kids that are like, I want buttered noodles, or I want a
Hmm.
turkey sandwich, just the bread and the
Right.
meat, and very plain, bland. The kids who are under responsive are going to be the ones who are want like tahini on their
Yeah.
fruit, and like want, like ketchup and mustard, and
Right.
just really flavorful, salty, sweet, high taste foods. So those kids are going to be really, if you're oversensitive to
Hmm.
smell, those kids are going to be like if someone's wearing perfume, or,
Yep.
good and bad smells, they're going to have an issue with it. It's going to be really distracting for
Okay.
them. And then kids, some kids aren't bothered by that at all and don't really appear to be bothered by any smells,
Right.
even if they're bad
Okay.
smells. um, okay, so then the three that like nobody's familiar with, unless you have a kid that has trouble processing sensory information, are the first one's your
Okay.
vestibular
Hmm.
system. So that's your balance. And so some kids have a really hard time with that. And so they might look kind of clumsy
Okay.
sometimes, or if they're under responsive to vestibular
Mhm.
input, those are going to be the kids that are like spinning all the time, or like, and you're like, oh my God, how are you not
Dizzy.
getting
Yeah.
dizzy? Yeah. And then the kids that are over responsive to that kind of input are going to be the opposite. They're going to be the ones that are like scared to go downstairs, or don't like to like tip their head back when they're getting their hair
Mm.
washed. Um, Stuff like that, or go down, a slide. So,
That's interesting because I was just thinking
yeah.
how I always think about that. There's like certain stairs too, depending on the depth or the incline of them, right? That you just assume it's like a
Yeah.
height thing for kids, but it's actually like I didn't even
Yeah.
think about that being like the vestibular portion of that because I've totally seen that with
Yeah. And
kids.
and
Yeah,
you
yeah,
wouldn't. Yeah. And it's so hard for them too, because I feel like they can't communicate they're what's
right.
happening inside them. I mean, that's really hard. And it's also, they don't know. Like if you've only been inside that body, you don't know how you're, supposed to feel when you go downstairs,
Right.
or what is supposed to be normal. Um, the next one is the
Mm-hmm.
proprioceptive system. So that's like in all our muscles, we have these receptor cells, and a lot of kids are under responsive to this kind of input. And so these are the kids that are going to be like running into stuff, jumping all the time. They're just craving that heavy, deep input, like falling on
Right.
purpose, crashing into stuff, crashing into other people. Um, knowing that and then giving your child like an activity that's heavy in
Okay.
proprioception can like help regulate them for,
Okay.
you
What's a
know,
good example of that, just if you don't mind, while we're on that specific topic? Like,
yeah. Oh, so heavy work, anything like carrying heavy
okay.
things, pushing a laundry basket full of heavy
Okay.
things, like any playground stuff, monkey bars,
Got it.
running. A lot of kids like to kind of be like, take pillows and like squish
Mm,
them or wrap them up really tight in like a
okay.
blanket. There's so many things. But the hard part is like you got to know what your child needs, because if that's not an issue for your child, say your kid's fine with proprioceptive input, but they're the ones that like to spin around, you try to squish them with a pillow, they're going to be like,
No.
no, thank you. Like that's not going to work for them,
Yeah.
So I think that's the hardest part is just finding out what your child's needs
Right.
actually are and then going from
Okay.
there.
Okay. And so vestibular, proprioceptive, and what's the third?
And then the third one is basically your ability to feel like your organs
Oh,
and stuff. So
wow.
you're gonna see that manifest itself in like some kids, seem like they're never
Okay.
hungry and maybe they're not feeling that sensation of
Oh,
hunger.
interesting.
Or if they're having a hard time with potty training, they might not be able to kind of like localize that feeling of like when your bladder's full. So it might kind of like show up that
Okay.
way.
So would that be something where a child who's not able to read that is all of a sudden just starving and on the brink of like starvation, where like they don't see that coming, like, or like, okay, like the potty
100%.
training, like I got to go
Yes.
now. I don't even have 3 seconds to hold it because it's now just hit me.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Makes
Yeah.
sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So just like the with your bladder, I
Yeah.
mean, your stomach's the same way. And so for a lot of kids, it's like, or they might not be able to really localize it that it's like around their stomach. They're like, I feel terrible. I don't know
Why?
why,
Got it.
but
Okay. Yes. Hence the hangry term that we all give our children when we have to read that for
yes.
them.
Yeah. And like we do that all the
Right.
time, it's parents get so concerned if, their children have some trouble processing sensory information and it's like we all do.
Right.
Like we just didn't have people, 40 years ago sitting down with our parents telling them this
Right.
stuff. We were just like it's
Yeah.
fine. But we all do twirl our hair, tap our
Hmm.
knee, or,
Yep.
we all do stuff to regulate ourselves that we're not even
Aware of. Yep.
aware of. Yeah. So we all have issues.
Yeah. Yes. And like our kids are so lucky that we actually have the education to provide, parents with these days and to be able to have these examples like you're giving and not have to read our
Yeah,
children's mind, but actually pick up on cues and their body language and the antecedents to certain
exactly.
behaviors, right? Yeah.
And then once you notice that and you notice what your child needs, it's so easy to go and be like, oh, we can just make this little change and,
Yeah.
it'll be
Right.
okay. But I get nervous when like you go on Amazon and there's like, oh, toys for kids with autism and they're all like super expensive and it's like a spinny chair that's like $100 and it's like, well, if that's not your kid's thing, then like that's just a waste of
Right.
money. You know what I
Right.
mean? So
Absolutely.
I think it's worth the time to kind of, if you do think your kid has some issues, to go get them checked out by an OT. And, we can do these assessments pretty
Yeah.
quickly. A lot of them are just parent interview. And then there's other assessments that are much more in depth. But I think, to just get started to know like where you're
Yeah.
at with your kid, it's not a bad idea to go get checked out if you have
Right.
concerns.
And I'm assuming that these are things that because obviously depending on what state you're in, there's different services birth to three and then three and up through the school district, but that you
Yeah.
might see some signs even under the age of three. Is that correct? Or is this more? Okay.
I mean, yeah, when you go back, I mean, I work now with very young children. And so, you can start to see as at babies, if you know what to look for. And, it's funny, a lot of parents that have kids that are diagnosed with an issue later in life, like we'll go back and look at baby videos and they're like, oh, there it is, but it's like, they're really subtle and hard to
Yeah.
spot. And, it's not something that a pediatrician even might necessarily notice in your 20-minute
Right.
well
Right.
visit while your kid's like freaking out because they're scared they're going to get a shot. Um, so, I mean,
Yeah,
yeah,
there's a lot of
it's
variables. So
really
yeah,
common.
you have to be able to
Mhm. Yeah.
filter those out. Okay, yes. I was thinking when kids get to school age too, and just depending on how their classroom's set up and what they're like, how long they're expected to sit in a chair and what is up on those walls. I was thinking how you're describing visual, right? Like I've had patients who've been in
Yeah.
classrooms that are so overwhelming that they can't even like they have to go take tests in the principal's office because this classroom is so
Yeah.
busy that they can't even focus on what's right in front of them.
Yeah. And and that's like every single
Yeah.
classroom for little
Right.
kids. It's just, visual bombardment on every single wall. And that's awesome for most kids. But for those kids that struggle with focus and especially when there's a lot going on,
Right.
like that's going to be challenging for
Yeah.
them. Um, but it's an easy fix, It's just you can put up a little trifold or just take down, when I used to work in a clinic, the room that I worked in, I had a ton of toys, but I had them all away in cupboards. So when the kid came in, there was like just a table and a chair, and that was
Okay.
it. And it's a game changer. I mean, really, when you can get a kid like that to just decrease some of the visual
Right.
stimulation. And that kind of brings up like this kind of a hot button topic right
Yeah.
now is like eye contact. A
Yes.
lot of people are like, you got to make eye contact, and for someone who is
Yep.
hypersensitive to visual input, that might be the one thing that just like pushes them over the edge
Right.
and makes it so that they can't continue the conversation.
Absolutely.
So actually, if you're having a hard time, if you know you're someone that gets easily overwhelmed by visual stimulation and you're in a conversation, I think actually looking down is a great way to regulate
Right.
yourself. You're taking away that stimulation, but you're also staying, in the
Right.
conversation with that person. So that's, kind of something for parents, I think, to keep in mind. I know it's really popular. I've written goals for eye contact long ago, and I'm kind of like look back and I was like, what was I doing? That was stupid.
Oh,
I should be,
absolutely.
like that. That's awesome that they are, choosing something that is subtle and like, they can still stay in the room with you, stay in the conversation.
Right.
It's beautiful,
Yes, you can be very
so
creative with ways to like show engagement with your children and teach them whether it's like right, like they can the fact that they're even if it's fleeting eye contact or just like you said, if they're looking down and but they're not looking elsewhere, or if they're touching you and letting you know I am here with
yeah,
you, right? Like just even holding your hand or something.
yeah,
But yes, I agree. I used to do that back when I did behavioral therapy with children with autism. It was like
uh,
that. I was like, I look back at some
yeah,
of the things I'm like, we were expected to do with these, and it's some of them. It's not even appropriate. Like it's like this is why do we decide what
100%.
is okay and not okay for behavior wise? But
Yeah.
yeah, just letting your child be your child, and then getting creative with
Yeah.
okay, how do we then function into society, into the classroom, into our family system?
And I almost think that in that way, we've really let this population down, like this community down. Like I think we as a community should understand that some people don't want to make eye contact with you, and it's not anything against you. It's not that they're
Right.
not paying attention to you. It's not that they're disrespecting
Yes.
you. They just can't,
Yeah.
and yeah, it gets a really bad
It
rap.
does.
And I feel like we just have as a society, we just don't understand, I think, sensory processing and autism, enough that we can like support all of these people, so many people,
Right. Yeah, and supporting the whole child, right? I agree that I think that there's a lot of high expectations when it's like, okay, would we rather our child be engaged and actually present hearing what we're saying, or is it the social cue of eye contact? Is that more important? Like, because if they are expected to
Yeah.
give that, they may not be able to be present and hearing what you're saying. And
100%. And I mean, eye contact is something that I've seen it so many times. I think with the positive reinforcement every time they make eye contact, I think the hope is that eventually they're just going to like start doing it
Right.
automatically in all environments and in all situations. And to be honest, like I've never seen that happen in 20 years. So I think that it's like, okay, that let's give that
Yeah,
up. And, I think once you really kind of understand more about sensory processing and
hmm,
that it's not something that you can just try
my
harder
gosh,
and
right.
do it, it's just how your body is just wired a little differently. And, and because of that, you have to do things a little
Exactly.
differently.
Yes, I think that was kind of the point when I remember when I did the self-regulation episode, that it's, there's executive function and there's emotional regulation, but there's also sensory regulation, right? And when we have all three of those and we're working super hard for our sensory input, and these kids are, especially like given wherever, even in the home or just at school, and they have these high expectations of having to regulate sensory input, and then they're spending so much energy doing that, like it's a wonder that like they can't, focus the way we expect their executive function to work, or they can't regulate certain
Yeah.
emotions that we're expecting them to be. So it's just a lot to balance.
It is so it's a lot for their little bodies. And I mean it's a lot even for, you think of an elementary school age kid and it's like when they get out of school, they're a disaster
Hmm.
because they've been trying so hard to hold it down all day and then they see you and they're like,
Yeah,
and it's the same thing, except these kids are doing it at a even more
right.
intense level. They're having to work even harder. Um,
Yeah.
so
So would you say that, I mean, part of our job as parents is maybe even having that reframe of, okay, when it's like we could be saying, oh, why do you always like this with me after school? But it could be like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you're able to feel safe with me to be able to let that all out. And then this is where I might have to be a little bit more creative of, okay, how can we help even you out a little bit right now? Or,
yeah, that's my
okay.
mantra. I'm like, oh, you're just so comfortable around me.
Yeah,
You must have been so good at school
exactly.
today.
So I always said, I'm like, okay, I can handle it at home. If that means you're put together at school, awesome. And but yeah,
One of the things that I've seen in my kids, my kids that I work with, um, is that it's really important to say you're like trying to teach them a skill and they're able to do it, whatever it is. And then you're trying to have them do it again maybe later on in the day when they're not as tired or maybe they were just rushing and they're not in the space where they can do it. It's okay to help them even though you know that they can do
okay,
it. I know as a parent I kind of had a hard time with that. Like I was like, well, I know you can do it, why can't you do it
right,
now? And it's like sometimes they just don't have the capacity. The cumulative effects of all this regulation that's been going on all day, if you don't get enough time to regulate yourself, it can just like keep
right,
building, especially if you're trying to get them to do something when they're tired and so it's okay to help your kid put their shoes on if you can tell they're in a rough space and you know that they can do it,
right,
but like don't feel bad that you're enabling them or that you're not making them be independent because there are some times where you have to look at the task and then you have to look at where they are at that
yeah,
moment and don't beat yourself up about if your kid can put their pajamas on but they're just can't do it at that moment. That is okay to like help them out and don't feel bad about
right.
it.
Yeah, because if anything, you look at that as let's give them a moment of success instead of this. Let's not have the next 15 minutes of frustration, and it doesn't help anyone. Yeah,
Yeah, it really doesn't. Everyone
yes.
loses. So it's like let's just, because
No, I think that's so important.
and wait for a time when they're, in a better
Right.
space to have them do more challenging
Yeah. No,
things.
I love that. And I think you touched on important things. I think as parents, we tend to put that pressure on ourselves, or just that expectation that, like, oh gosh, I'm giving in right now, or like you said, enabling. And I don't like, it's like we have to stick strong and be consistent. But like, it's also like we have to be realistic that there's like, just like we have moments of up and down, our kids are going to have
Yeah.
moments where it's just too much for them in that moment, and it's not enabling them. It's
Mhm.
actually just, we're giving them a little bit more scaffolding or more support in that moment.
Yes, 100%. And a analogy that I tell a lot of my parents is kind of like with
Right.
glasses, right? If you're nearsighted, we're gonna get you some
Right.
glasses. Like we're not gonna be like, just try
Yeah.
harder. You can do it. Come on,
So true.
like that's no. And so it's not when you think of it like
Right.
that, and I think that's why a lot of the term sensory diet has kind of had its moment, and is because it's kind of like it makes it sound like it's a temporary thing. Like,
Oh
oh, you
yeah.
just wear these glasses for a couple
Yeah.
months and then you'll be good. And it's like, well,
That
that's not
makes
really how it
sense.
works,
Okay.
right? So when you kind of think of it like
Hmm.
that, as this is more of like a modification that, you're going to have the foreseeable
Right.
future, and it's not something, maybe you don't need to wear your glasses all the time, but you probably have them with you if you need
Right.
them. And that's exactly how these strategies are for these
Right.
kids, so maybe I can make eye contact with you until I get to maybe a topic I don't feel as comfortable, and then I'm overwhelmed, and yeah, I'm
Right.
gonna look down and keep talking, and
Right.
just to have those little tricks in your bag that you can kind of like pull out, so it doesn't end up being like you're like screaming, running out of the room
Yeah. No,
situation.
I love that analogy. That's so true. That and it makes sense because like when I was teaching special ed, it was sensory diet was such a big term, but it makes so much more sense to think of it that way. That this is like a pair of glasses, right? Like, yeah, I love that. That you're going to have these things, and as parents, we're going to have these tools available to our kids, and it's not by any means a set time frame. It's just this is whatever
Yeah.
when they need it to succeed, they're going to have it available. Yeah.
Exactly. And some days they're going to need nothing, and some days they're going to need a lot
Yeah.
more. And so that's the other thing too, where it's like it's not going to be like do these exercises whatever every day at this time. It's like some days they won't need that, and some days that's all they're going to need, and so it's so
Yeah.
variable on the
That
child.
makes sense. So yeah, meeting your child where they are in that moment. It doesn't, we're not going to have a, as much as we all want that textbook that it has it planned out from minute by minute or hour to hour what we're supposed to do with our kids. It's just every moment's going to be a little bit different in what they need.
Yeah, exactly. And just, I mean, just don't beat yourself up. Like, give yourself some grace. This is not a thing that, anyone's ever been
Right.
taught about their kids. And so unless you have a problem with this and you learn about it, you're not going to know about it. It's not like they teach you at the hospital, like all the other
I know.
stuff, when you're taking
Yeah,
all those classes. So,
absolutely. I was like, I would not know what this was if I had not taught special ed from birth to five. I would not know half of this stuff. I wouldn't even like some of the terms. I'd be like, what is that? And so, like you said, unless you're actually exposed to it, unless there is a high need for it, this isn't like common knowledge that we're just chatting about over coffee. Yeah.
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 So, and it's a lot of things that, people, no one's ever taken the parents down to actually really explain why this is happening or what's going on with their child. And I think that's so empowering for the parent to know, like, what my child's triggers are. And, so that eventually they can teach the child what their own triggers
Right.
are and how to advocate for themselves and what their needs are. But, I think the parents' understanding is like the most
Mhm.
important thing. I have like I made a handout in English and Spanish for my families that, a lot of them have a hard time when their kids are stimming and they're like want it to stop, and I'm like, oh, like let's like talk more about like what it actually is,
Yeah.
and that it's actually they're like meeting their needs, and
Right.
like automatically they're assessing their own needs, regulating
Right.
themselves, it's actually that's the goal. Like that's what
Yeah.
we want them to do. So it's just a lot of, not any of this is intuitive.
Right.
And so it's just a lot of, education and like learning about it, which we haven't, had in our
Right.
society, because a lot of people, until the 80s were not even in public.
Right. Yeah.
So
No, definitely. So it's I love that too, just the empowerment and education, just to be able as a parent to even, and this is what I see in my office too, is like looking at what okay, but what is it bringing up for you if your child is doing that and it's making you uncomfortable, but like then if they have that
Mhm.
educational piece that say like, okay, well, this is why they're doing it, and this is what it's actually doing for them, and this is where it's actually a good thing because they're learning that self-regulation. And then
Yeah.
maybe it's like not so much, the feelings that are coming up, and also validating those parents, like your parents that are going through this. It is having an open mind and having compassion, like you said, and grace,
Mhm.
and not being judgmental on either yourself or your child, but just that this is what
Yeah.
it is, and
This
we're
is
doing the
them,
best we
and
can.
that's yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Exactly. And it's hard, I feel like, because, our society doesn't really understand autism. It's really hard for families to go out in public, because not that they can't parent their child,
Right.
but parenting a child who's perceiving the world much differently, it looks different.
Yeah.
And a lot of families I found won't go do things out in the community, like go run errands, go
Right.
out to eat, because people just give them dirty looks and think they're terrible parents. And that is where I feel like as a society, we've just completely failed
Right.
this community, because they should be like, that's awesome that they brought them out. They're
Yes.
doing exactly what they should be
Absolutely.
doing.
Yes.
And, they don't need your Mima like staring them down at Target.
Right.
um, so it's a lot of stuff like that where I think as we just all need to know more
Right.
about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I think, the education, and probably even a village too, right? Just to be able to have that community of people that can really empathize and understand what's going on.
And yeah, those parents they're going through it, and they're like, I am always just blown away. Like the kids are so cute and amazing, but the parents are the ones that I'm just like,
Yeah.
wow, they blow me away, because it is so hard to have a kid with any kind of special
Right.
needs. And I think if you have a typical child, like, I'm so happy for you, but like, you have no
Right.
idea unless you
Exactly.
are around day in and day
Right.
out with someone who has a child with special needs. Like,
Yeah.
it's, I don't, it's, they're
Yeah.
warriors. Like, I don't understand how it's
I agree
amazing.
100%.
So,
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so much, Mindy, for being here today and
yeah.
talking all this stuff that I feel like you said we don't talk about enough. So I'm so glad we can have this platform and episode for people to start really getting more information and feeling comfortable seeking out help if need be.
Yeah. Thank you, Chelsea.
That's it for this week's edition of Project Parenthood. Remember to be curious, open, accepting, kind, and non judgmental on your conscious parenting journey. If you have any questions about this episode, about your parenting journey, and/or topics you would like to hear more about, please reach out to parenthood@quickanddirtytips.com or leave a message at 646-926-3243. Project Parenthood is a Quick and Dirty Tips podcast. Thanks to the team at Quick and Dirty Tips, Holly Hutchings, Davina Tomlin, Morgan Christensen, and Brennan Getchus. May you be happy, safe and protected, healthy and strong, and live with ease.